Right, well, good evening and welcome everybody. First, a few words about the organisation of the evening. We intend the meeting to last about an hour and a half. And Leon will speak for maybe 45 minutes, 30 to 45 minutes. We'll see how it goes. And then we'll throw it open to questions. We're going to keep everyone except the speakers muted during the course of this evening. So if you have questions, if any questions occur to you during the talk, please put them in the chat facility and we'll take them as best we can in order. Okay. So this is North London Friends of Israel. A very big welcome, especially to those of you who aren't familiar with us and our work. Those who are familiar will know that our main focus in normal times is local campaigning. We obviously couldn't do much of that during the lockdowns, but we're delighted that things are back to normal and we can resume our presence in the community. I don't want to take up time on this now, as we're obviously waiting to hear from our speaker, Leon. So I'll say more about our forthcoming activities at the end of the session. So to tonight's topic, we're delighted to host Leon Pein, who's been campaigning for Israel for many years. He claims it's 50, but I wasn't convinced he looked old enough. I'm sure he may correct me on that. Anyway, we're delighted that, like me, he's a member of the North London Friends of Israel committee and a very great asset he is to us as well. So it's with great pleasure and interest that I hand over the floor to Leon.
Thank you very much, Harry, for that wonderful introduction. I have, in fact, been studying Middle East situation for the last 50 years, but that's ever since I was 10. So.
Oh, fair. I'm impressed.
Thank you. So what I'll do tonight is, as you mentioned, I'll speak for about 30 to 40 minutes and then answer questions on the talk itself and then the general Middle East situation. So if people are happy to, and if they don't get a chance to answer questions in the main talk, I'm happy to stay on at the end. So thank you very much for attending tonight. I hope everyone's well and not suffering from COVID too much. If you have to excuse me if it looks like I'm reading us, because I am, so apologies for that. Many of you who are listening tonight will be campaigning against anti-Semitism or campaigning for Israel. And so you'll naturally react to the myriad number of unpleasant things that appear in the press and on TV. For example, most of you will be familiar with the attack on a group of Jewish kids who were celebrating Hanukkah and the subsequent unwarranted reporting by the BBC, which blamed the victims, for which the BBC has belatedly half apologised after a significant outcry. And as another example, some of you may have complained in the past to the BBC or Channel 4 or whomever for their biased coverage. Again, many of you will find it frustrating that the constant coverage of defensive and retaliatory attacks by Israel, when multiple war crimes have been committed by Palestinian groups, and by that I mean the firing of rockets from civilian areas towards civilian areas, thus completely ignoring the context of the initial attacks and just focusing on the defensive measures, presenting Israel as the aggressor, when in fact it's completely the reverse, simply because it fits the prevailing narrative of weak against strong. So I think all of you, or many of you, may have noticed this and experienced it in the past and know that it makes Jews vulnerable in Britain, which leads to heavy security measures at synagogues, schools, Jewish schools, charities and communal events. Nothing deadly has happened here, but in Scandinavia, in the USA, in Germany and in Austria, at synagogues, Jews and bystanders and police have been murdered. Just finally on that particular point of negative start, I apologise, but it sets the scene because I'm going to reverse the position in a minute. But some of you may also have heard about the very unpleasant scenes in Stamford Hill at the weekend, when an open-top bus was rented and paraded through the streets with loudspeakers shouting, "Yids go home." So that, obviously that's extremely distressing for people, and it's got to be acted upon. But if we look at the Middle East, the situation's different. It is very easy to get caught up in the moment of the latest anti-Semitic outrage. It's completely understandable. I do. It's pretty bad, and it's easy to be despondent. And I often share the despondency. However, what I want to do tonight is to take a look at the historical viewpoint and then see how the Abraham Accords fit in. So that's the focus of my talk today. It doesn't reflect North London Friends of Israel's view. In fact, we don't have a view as a group. It's 100% my opinion. It's based on the analysis and judgments that I've made from my experience of fighting both left-wing and right-wing anti-Semitism and studying the Middle East and the Arab-Israel conflict over the last 5 decades. So I'll give a potted historical summary, and then I'll bring us to the present day. Now, I might zoom through things if you'll excuse the bad pun, but there's no need to take notes because Harry's making a recording and he's going to release it after the meeting. That's correct, isn't it, Harry? It's going to be a link, right?
Sorry, I was muted
okay.
then. That is
No
correct.
So, Harry, if you could show the map, please, that I sent you, the Middle East. Whilst Harry's doing that, I'll explain. I'm going to briefly explain the Abraham Accords and what they are for those people who might not know in detail. But could you expand it? Sorry, Harry.
No,
great, thanks.
That's
in 2020, as probably most of you know, President Trump surprised the world by announcing that Israel, the United Arab Emirates, that's Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and 3 other tiny oil-rich states, which if you look, I don't know if I can point, but if you look center right, you see Oman next to the blue. Thank you for pointing it out, if that's you, Harry. The United Arab Emirates is to the left of that. And if you look above the blue to Iran, you can see the physical size of Iran, and down below to Saudi Arabia. So the 2 of those, Saudi Arabia and Iran, are very much in competition, and the United Arab Emirates and below, between them, and Qatar and Oman are sort of caught in the middle in a sense. So Israel, the UAE, which comprises Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and the other oil-rich city-states, together with Bahrain, which is pretty small. In fact, I'm struggling to see it, but it's around there, signed a peace treaty, signed an agreement, not a peace treaty because they were never at war with Israel. They signed an agreement with Israel. And this was groundbreaking. They were the first the first countries that hadn't fought a war with Israel to sign an agreement. They were followed by Sudan and Morocco. Now, when it was announced, the United Arab Emirates, you can take it away, Harry, it's fine. Thank you. When the announcement was made, the United Arab Emirates foreign minister stood at the White House and announced that today, I quote, "We are already witnessing a change in the heart of the Middle East. This new vision is not a slogan. The region's youth are looking forward to taking part in this great humanitarian movement," he said. "This will spur stability, growth, a new civilized approach that opens the doors of opportunity for those who look towards peace, prosperity in the future." And most people looking at the Middle East wouldn't associate those words with the Middle East. So it's quite an opportunity to look at the dichotomy, the split that's occurring in the Middle East between what you hear on the news and what's going on behind the scenes. So these small states that you saw surrounding or around Saudi Arabia, they're the leading proponents of a new vision that for a region that's really been enveloped by conflict and war for the last 50 plus years and even before that. And the idealism that the foreign minister spoke about is obviously far removed from what you see in Yemen, where there's a terrible civil war, in Libya, in Lebanon, or in Syria, where the tribal politics are vicious, there are appalling wars, but it does resonate what the foreign minister said, it resonates with young people in the region, as well as some of the elite who see the dangerous direction that the region took previously. So this camp has, this peace camp, if I may, has adopted a path of modernization for which the previous ethnic and sectarian politics are an existential threat for them as well as Israel. So that's the Abrahamic Accord. So I just want to jump back and look a little bit at the history. Excuse me. So let's move to 1948, when we, the Jews, regained our independence after 2,000 years of ethnic cleansing, genocide, exile, imperialism, and colonialist occupation of our historic homeland. Modern day Zionism, our Jewish national movement, succeeded in just 50 years. Unfortunately, it was 10 years too late to solve to save the Jews of the Holocaust, but that's unfortunate. Now, in 1948, miraculously, the Jews, the Holocaust survivors, 600,000 Holocaust survivors, and the recent immigrants fought off the invading Arab armies at great loss. Moving forward to 1973, now almost 50 years ago, that year was the last year that an Arab nation invaded and fought a war with and tried to destroy Israel. That's well over 2 generations ago, almost 3. That's somewhat important in itself, but what's lesser known and probably as important is the demographic makeup of the Middle East. Because the 21st century now finds that the Middle East is younger, it's more educated than ever. Over 65% of people are under the age of 30, and they're ready for change. Most Arabs have no memory of the big wars that were fought with Israel in the last century. 1948, 1956, 1967, 1973. And milder opinions are now being encouraged by a lot of Arab leaders who see Israel as an ally against Iran. Let's move forward another 40 years to the 2010s. So you may recall, it began with the so-called Arab Spring uprisings for democracy. However, because the only non-governmental organizations that were permitted under the dictatorships that ruled in the Middle East, that often lasted for decades, the only organizations were religious organizations, and therefore these were the best organized, in fact, probably the only organized civil societies who were therefore able to capitalize on the ending of repression. And when the elections came, they found themselves in power. Because naturally, when the newfound freedoms came along, lots of democratic groups sprang up. The young people were very enthusiastic, and they splintered. And the relatively homogenous religious blocs did very well. For example, in Egypt, where after the dictator was overthrown, there was lots of joy and excitement, but an Islamist party won control. And it was then overthrown by anti-religious riots on the street and the military coup. So it's effectively back to where it was. So that decade, the 2010s continue with the collapse of governments and dictatorships in Syria, Yemen, Libya, Lebanon, and Iraq. And this pretty chaotic decade was the result of resistance politics, or what is termed resistance politics, and armed struggle. It's tribal and identity politics in the Middle East. And the rise and the growth of non-state powers with which you're probably all familiar, for example, the Islamic State, ISIL, Hezbollah, and Hamas. What's also changed, with which you might be less familiar, is the growth of Arab media. For example, Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera is a news agency based in Qatar, which has come to rival the biggest news agencies in the world, such as the BBC and big American corporations. These Al Jazeera, despite what you may think of it, has actually been a catalyst for change and for reform in Arab politics. Previously, an Islamic discourse, an Islamic and an Arab unity discourse held sway in the Middle East for decades. There was even a concept of an amalgamation, a unity between Egypt and Syria. So if you think back to the map that Harry showed just before, they're actually physically split. They're not even connected. So it was pie in the sky. But these sort of things held sway. The concept of Arab unity was a very powerful one, and that combined with an Islamic discourse those two became the only expression for the Arab masses. It became an effective moral political truth. An opposition to it was an assault on the very legitimacy of Arab beliefs. And it resulted in very fiery rhetoric in support of resistance groups against Israel, against other states. There were constant battles between Arab states. But today, increasing numbers of Arabs see an urgent need to shift away from this, because the resistance groups, they preach purely radical, warlike Islamist politics. You may be familiar with the fact that circa 90% of Muslims are Sunni Muslims, and approximately 10% of Muslims are Shia Muslims, SIJA. And there's a history of pretty dreadful violent conflict between them, stretching back centuries. That, combined with the Islamic terrorist groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, and similar groups, have been responsible for the killing of 500,000 people in Lebanon, Syria, Libya, Iraq, and Yemen. And this resistance politics, it's increasingly perceived by young Arabs as an obstacle preventing a better future for them. Also in the 2010s, and even before that, the internet and smartphones became much more available, we know, but also in the Middle East. And so young Arabs became aware, when they really weren't before, that a better life was not only a possibility, but that many people, especially in the West, like us, had lived a good life for generations. And that's had a powerful effect on them. They've moved away from thinking about the religious to the personal. So let's move to the recent past. And I think I'd like to remind ourselves of a number of, at the time, astonishing things that happened that we shouldn't forget. In fact, we should probably remind ourselves of them on a regular, if not daily basis. The first one is, as you probably all know, in 2017, President Trump reversed decades of US policy by recognizing Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights in the northeast of Israel. Here's how experts, a supposedly impartial, independent global news group, covered the story. Harry, please, could you show the Reuters article? So if you look at the little bit of text below that, it's the narrative of that this move upset the Arab world and Western allies. So it had actually been US policy. It had been mandated by both houses of Congress decades ago, but it had been repeatedly and continually deferred by no less than 13 consecutive United States presidents. So it was a very bold move. Thank you, Harry, you can take it off. So not only did Trump recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital, and announced the relocation of the United States embassy to Jerusalem, which was a major diplomatic blow to the Palestinians and made them break off ties with Washington. But on 25th of March 2019, Trump reversed decades of US policy by recognizing Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. Sorry, I said that already, my apologies. And he removed opposition to Israeli settlement building on the West Bank. I think it's useful to compare what followed such momentous events in the past. If you are familiar with the 1978 peace treaty that Egypt signed with Israel, what followed was that Egypt was immediately expelled from the Arab League. The Arab League is a coalition of dozens of Arab states. And previously, after pro-Israel moves, blatantly pro-Israel moves, or even the slightest of pro-Israel move by foreign powers, the foreign ministers would immediately call a meeting of the Arab League where they basically fall over themselves to angrily denounce these moves so that they could divert attention from their police states and appeal to the Arab masses. That no longer takes place. It did work for decades. It fooled most of the people most of the time, including, as you'll see now, the venerable US Secretary of State and many senior Western politicians. Harry's going to show you a video. It makes me laugh every time I see it. It's a short extract of the United States Secretary of State under the Obama administration, name of John Kerry, speaking very forthrightly on YouTube. Harry.
Lindsey Graham about you, and he said the thing about John Kerry you have to know is if you burn his...
There will be no separate peace between Israel and the Arab world. I want to make that very clear to all of you. I've heard several prominent politicians in Israel sometimes saying, well, the Arab world's in a different place now. We just have to reach out to them and we can work some things with the Arab world and we'll deal with the Palestinians. No, 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 and no. I can tell you that, reaffirmed even in the last week as I have talked to leaders of the Arab community. There will be no advance and separate peace with the Arab world without the Palestinian process and Palestinian peace. Everybody needs to understand that. Yeah, but it depends, Jeff. I think it really is a question. Let's stay big picture
So
here.
I'll let that sink in a little bit, perhaps. He was obviously completely wrong, and President Trump managed to break the mold in that sense. So I mentioned demographics before. In the Middle East, the 21st century found the Middle East to be younger, more educated than ever, with over 65% of people under the age of 30. There's something called the Arab Youth Survey, which is done on a regular basis and across the Middle East. It polls 18 to 24-year-olds, and it found that the latest poll found that a couple of interesting things that I want to mention. The first one is that religious fervor, and we associate a lot of religious fervor with the Middle East, but religious fervor seems to be in decline. Religion is now seen as a source of concern. 79% of respondents felt the Arab world needed to reform its religious institutions. 66% said that religion plays too great a role in the Middle East. I think looking from the outside, we can all wholeheartedly agree with that, but it's quite a surprise to think that the population itself thinks that. The Arab youth appear to be increasingly moderate. They were beginning to reject religious extremism. They accept normalization with Israel, and they favor pragmatic steps rather than the sweeping ideological movements of the past. It's particularly true of the under 30s, which is half of the Arab population. The older generation, which controls the discourse and controls the policies, isn't far behind. In fact, it's listening. And you'll see that in some of the policies I'm going to mention now, and also the speech that the UAE foreign minister made on the steps of the White House. So the data shows a significant departure of the Arab public from their previous fixation on national and religious causes, moving now towards religious concerns. The Arab Spring and the subsequent events profoundly shocked the region. the regimes that had maintained stability at the expense of economic freedoms and cultural and political expression died. And the demise of these invincible dictators unleashed forces which resulted in carnage, death, and displacement, and that's had an effect on the youth. So the second insight is that security and the economy are now the top priorities. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is framed in significantly less dogmatic language. There's far less of the blood-curdling phrases that we used to hear. And it's basically become less of a concern to the Middle East. The Arab Gulf youth, the youth from Bahrain, Kuwait, those countries that you saw on the map around Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates, are now the most educated in the Arab world. It used to be that Egypt was the center of the Arab world, but it's now shifted. Female education, you might have an image of women being very heavily repressed in the Middle East, but in the Gulf states, female education parallels some of the most developed nations. In fact, the United Arab Emirates has the highest percentage of college-educated women in the world, bigger than more than Western Europe, more than the USA. One of these women is who follows me on Twitter. Is quite a high-placed official in the UAE, and I post the most strident pro-Israel tweets on Twitter. She hasn't blocked me yet. In fact, we had an hour-long discussion just before Christmas, and we're discussing a business investment. So this augurs well. Many Arabs in Iraq, Syria, and Libya, they courageously, despite danger to their lives, they now say they favor relations with Israel. So the momentum for peace across the Arab world is real and it's growing. Many of the people, as I mentioned, consider the wars to be ancient history. Now, there are 57 Muslim majority and Arab states in the world. I was going to focus on some of them individually and then as a group to give you a picture of really what's going on behind the scenes, because in isolation, each move that they make is a trickle, but look together, it becomes a torrent of good news. So I was going to go on at length, but I see that time is going on. So I'm just going to mention a few of them. Egypt. So Egypt, you might recall, has had what is termed a cold peace with Israel for decades, which means almost no person-to-person interaction, no tourism, or very little tourism, cultural exchanges. It's pretty much government to government. But suddenly, after the Abraham Accords came along, Egypt found itself outflanked diplomatically, and it's become much more positively disposed. It expelled, about 50 years ago, in the 1950s, it expelled practically all of its Jews. There were race riots in Egypt, along with race riots across the Middle East. Now, the government is renovating Jewish cemeteries. It's renovating the biggest synagogue in the Middle East. If you compare that with the indigenous Egyptian Christians, the Egyptian Copts, who number 14 million, they suffer from invasions of their churches and they're often burnt down. So it seems strange enough that Jews are actually better treated than Christians in Egypt, which is a turnaround. If you look at Bahrain, was is one of the Gulf states. It was one of the signatories, co-signatories to the Abraham Accords. It's actually opened up more than the United Arab Emirates, the UAE, which is the instigator of the Abraham Accords. Even during coronavirus, when there was a partial lockdown, there were 60 planes a week flying from Dubai to Israel. They've established a ministry of tolerance in the United Arab Emirates, and the year of tolerance was announced. Pakistan, another Muslim country, it's always been a hotbed of racism and hatred. The word itself, Pakistan, means land of the pure. You may recall that a woman who converted from Islam to Christianity was sentenced to death. It's a very unpleasant place. But Pakistan-Israel relations were recently discussed on Pakistani national TV. Indonesia is the world's largest Muslim majority nation. It's got 270 million people. It's flirting with diplomatic relations with Israel. In fact, last month, the United States Secretary of State was out there discussing with officials the possibility of Indonesian ties with Israel. Libya sponsored Palestinian terrorism for 40, 50 years. The Libyan Prime Minister last month met with the head of the Mossad to discuss normalization and security cooperation. Iraq is the only country officially still at war with Israel. It sent forces to every major war to try and destroy Israel in 1948, 67, 73. Feelings run deep in the Middle East. In September, 4 months ago, a group of 300 senior Iraqis bravely issued a public plea. And they said, we live under the repression of terrorism, or we can die with courage. The joint declaration that they made calls for Iraq to join the trend for normalization with Israel. That conference at which they issued the declaration triggered significant condemnation and death threats, but it also made headlines throughout the Arab world. Bangladesh is also poised to, there's a report I have from December last year, is poised to normalize ties with Israel. Turkey, a very important Muslim state, is also seeking to renegotiate ties with Israel. Saudi Arabia, the big one. The Saudi Arabian royal family are the guardians of the most sacred site in Islam, in Mecca. They regularly fight with themselves internally over relations with Israel. There's a constant debate going on. The official position is that they're prepared to normalize relations with Israel if Israel accepts the 2002 Saudi Arabian peace plan. That's their official position. It's currently unacceptable to Israel, but that's for public consumption, I believe. There's an old phrase in the Middle East that you don't listen to what an Arab says, you look at what an Arab does. Late last year, Israeli media reported that a delegation of senior American Jewish leaders visited Saudi Arabia to meet with senior officials. They met at least 6 government ministers and senior representatives of the royal household with a view to establishing ties between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Now, if you're familiar with the Abraham Accords, you might recall that visits by senior Jews, non-Israeli Jews, are often a precursor to diplomatic relations. And in fact, I have a scoop here that, from the horse's mouth itself, that a senior member of the British Jewish community is now in Saudi Arabia. In fact, he might have left, is now discussing that very process. So there might be an announcement on diplomatic relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel in the near future. The Saudis themselves, they're on record of accusing Palestinian leaders of betraying their people, which is quite a shift in Arab discourse. The Saudi Arabian Crown Prince is even distancing himself, the young Crown Prince, he's even distancing himself from political Islam. Last April, he challenged what's called Wahhabism. It's the radical Islamist ideology which was adopted by Al-Qaeda, which led to the Twin Towers massacre in 2000, the 9/11 massacre at the World Trade Towers. He's called for a reinterpretation of Islamic dogma. And I extract from his speech, he said, if Muhammad were with us today and found us committed blindly to his texts, closing our minds, he would be the first to object. There were no fixed schools of thought and no infallible person. we should engage in continuous reinterpretation of Quranic texts, and all fatwas should be based on time, place, and mindset in which they are issued. It hasn't yet made peace with Israel, but it is allowing Jews and even Israelis in on foreign passports. So next year in Mecca, perhaps, as Jews say at Pesach. In fact, the Crown Prince has defied his own clerics, and he's sponsoring archaeological digs of Jewish sites in the hopes of attracting Jewish tourists. Mecca, although it's the most sacred site in Islam, was originally a Jewish town. Originally a Jewish tribe inhabited Mecca. So leaving the Middle East for a bit, let's looking at Israel. Looking at Israel and relations with the rest of the world. Until the 1990s, the Jewish state was still ostracized by two superpowers, the Indians and the Chinese. Now, India, China, and the entire Eastern Bloc, which formerly refused to even host an Israeli ambassador, now have full trading relations, diplomatic, commercial, cultural relations. India is a very strong ally. It buys hundreds of millions of pounds worth of Israeli defensive weapons from it. So all in all, just to summarize, today, over half of the Arab population live in countries that have peace treaties or normalized relations with Israel, while much of the other half live in failing states. Israel's formally at peace with 6 Arab countries. It's got Arab allies against Iran. And most of the neighbors realize that Israel is now a valuable and full-fledged member of the Middle East. Harry, I could say more, but I think I'll leave it there and take questions.
Thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Just a moment. Well, thank you very much for that, Leon, for a very interesting and stimulating talk. I was hoping there'd be some questions in the chat. We don't have any yet, but please, everybody feel free to put questions if you have them. It does occur to me, I don't know if this is a question or what, but it does occur to me that there is an irony here, that whereas so much in the West seems to be moving against Israel, so that we have what is sometimes called woke culture or critical race theory, and all of those tendencies which are violently hostile to Israel. And even if they're not making headway in the general population, they're certainly making headway in some very important institutions, such as the universities and elsewhere. And yet, ironically, in the Middle East, the people who they think they're supporting are moving in the opposite direction. So that in the past, sort of 50, 60 years ago, practically everybody in the West supported Israel, and practically everybody in the Middle East was violently hostile to Israel. And it's getting more and more going in the opposite direction. Yes. Got any thoughts on that?
Well, I do. Yes. In fact, I've discussed it with people recently, and my feeling is that it's safer to walk in the streets of Dubai wearing a kippah, on a skull cap on your head, than it is to walk the streets of central London.
Or indeed New York.
Yeah. Hundreds, I think 100,000 or 60,000, 100,000 Israelis have visited Dubai in the last 6 to 12 months. There's been a flood. And yes, the Palestinian cause was always a tool for autocratic dictators who were seeking a scapegoat to divert attention from their police states. And Islamic radicals used it as a simple rallying point. But now that people can see in the West how people live, they see through this rhetoric. So it is ironic that there's been a switch with far left people who I think are the minority, who simply blithely ignore the appalling massacres going on across the Middle East and focus exclusively on a Palestinian with a nosebleed, if you'll excuse the expression. It's like a Palestinian Muslim who's injured is worth 1,000 Syrian tortured and dead people. It's a strange form of tokenism and hypocrisy and blindness. Mm. That's my rather forthright opinion.
Absolutely. We do now have some questions. So we have one from Ruth Mastron, who says, living in the US, I'm curious to know how the Biden administration's stance on Israel is seen from Britain and Europe. Any thoughts on that?
Oh, I do. I'll sum them up with two words. Dangerous appeasement. Because it seems to me that they are going cap in hand. I'm talking specifically about Iran. The whole of the Middle East, ex-Iran, most of the Middle East, the Sunni Arab states, so Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, and all the Gulf states, Abu Dhabi, Kuwait, Qatar, are very fearful of Iran. Iran, the Persians, previously have been sticking it to the Arabs for thousands of years. So when Westerners look out at the Middle East, they have a very monolithic view, and they don't really understand that there's a tremendous amount of internecine conflict between Arabs. They just look on it as a block. So the Arab states are absolutely terrified of Iran, and they're scared of it building a nuclear missile. And they look on Israel as the strongest power in the Middle East, the only one with the strength and the will to fight back.
Okay, thanks for that. And we have another question, which I guess follows on from that. Can you see any optimistic signs from Iran? I'm presuming the questioner is not talking about the government, but
no, that's
other aspects of society.
That's an excellent question. Yes, I do. A lot. But it's remarkable how dictatorships manage to sustain themselves. The Soviet Union lasted for 60 years. I think the half-life of a dictatorship, it seems to be 40 to 60 years. Soviet Union lasted 60 years. China, the Chinese communist dictatorship has been going since 49, so that's 60 years. Iran itself is an empire. About 50% of the Iranian people don't really consider themselves Iranian so much. To the north, there's Azerbaijan, and a significant percentage of the population in Iran are Azerbaijani. And they feel great ties to Azerbaijan with the north. To the east, I think, of Iran. Yeah, to the east you've got Afghanistan. Might be worth putting that map up again, Harry, so don't forget the map. But yeah, to the east they've got conflict with Afghanistan, and they've got conflict with Pakistan. 40%, I think, of the population is under the poverty level. The government is very keen on, thank you. Yeah, so if you look at Iran, central north, Azerbaijan in the blue, to the east is Afghanistan, to the southeast is Pakistan, to the west is Iraq. From 1980 to 1990, it fought a terrible 10-year-long war with Iraq. So Iraq at that time was controlled by a Sunni Muslim dictator called Saddam Hussein. There were regular riots on the streets. they regularly close off the internet, and the country is run by Islamists, is run by mullahs, and there's a group, I think, of 12 of them who supported by the Revolutionary Guards and a group, I can't remember the name, but it's akin to Hitler's, what was it? The not the stormtroopers, the people who used to fight him on the streets. I can't remember the name. Apologies, but they have a quasi-governmental force who enforces their rule. So there's a lot going on. There's a group called White Wednesdays. There's a group of women who bravely take off their chadols, the veil. Thank you, the Basij, Basij, it's called, who are basically street thugs who enforce the strict regulations. There's a group of women I mentioned who take off their veils and make videos. They get imprisoned. And unfortunately, some of them are tortured. So there is a lot going on behind the scenes, but it's not easy to get information out. I think the best way to deal with Iran is what I term death by 1,000 cuts, which is a continuation of all the threats from outside that I've just mentioned, and Israel fighting it in Syria and not acknowledging. What happens in the Middle East is if you don't acknowledge the source of an attack, generally the other side doesn't feel under such pressure to respond. So it's quite common for attacks to be made frequently and no attribution taken. That's not if you're a terrorist group, if you're a state. So Iran has basically control over lots of Syria, and Israel is fighting that because Iran constantly makes blood-curdling threats against Israel and threatening to destroy it. And that's why Israel's so scared about Iran developing a nuclear weapon. I hope that didn't ramble too much and answered the question. If not, please ask more.
Oh, that's fine. I'm going to stop share now. I'm assuming you don't need the map now.
Thank you.
Yeah, a couple more questions. From David Stone. Welcome, David. I should mention to those who don't know that David is a doughty pro-Israel campaigner and very articulate one in his own right. And his question is, a curious phenomenon is that Israel's rapprochement with several Arab countries coincides with Israeli Arabs' stronger identification as Israelis and by an Arab political party joining Israel's governing coalition. Could all these trends be related?
Well, I'm in doughty, how can I put it? I think David could answer that much better than I himself. So I hope I answered in a suitable way. And thank you for bringing it up, because I was going to mention Israeli Arabs, but I thought I should cut the talk short because it was going on. So I'll just say here now what I was going to say, that Israeli Arabs, as you probably all know, 20% of the Israeli population is Muslim. There's the Israeli Arab politician called Mansour Abbas heads the Islamist party, the United Arab List, and he's a member of Israel's ruling coalition. A couple of weeks ago, I think it was, he made a simple statement. It went right under the radar. Nobody outside of Israel noticed it, but I think it's very, very significant. When he basically recognized Israel's existence as a Jewish state in accordance with the United Nations partition plan. And his words were, Israel was born as a Jewish state. That was a decision of the Jewish people to establish a Jewish state. In fact, he spoke in Hebrew, no less. And he said, the question is not what is the, sorry, just bear with me. He said, the question is not what is the identity of the state. That's how the state was born and so it will remain. It's the reality. The question's not about the state's identity, but what the status of Arab citizens will be in it. So it was remarkable, notwithstanding that there were riots, anti-Israel riots in central Israeli cities during the war, during the skirmishes last year. But the head of the largest Arab party, one in the Israeli government, has now come out to recognize a Jewish state. And I strongly suspect that's another undermining of the Palestinian narrative. So I hope that answers your question. Harry, do you mind just telling me the question again to check if I've answered it?
Right. I'll just read out David's question again. A curious phenomenon is that Israel's, sorry, it's just scrolled up, bear with me. A curious phenomenon is that Israel's rapprochement with several Arab countries coincides with Israeli Arabs' stronger identification of it as Israelis, and by an Arab political party joining Israel's governing coalition. So the question is, the punchline, if you like, is could all these trends be related?
I think it answers itself. Yes, I think that's quite correct. Yeah, it definitely had an effect.
Okay, thanks. A couple of, not questions, but comments, but I'll read them out from Karen and David. So interesting and informative and important to be briefed in this way. Here's one for you, Leon. Any chance of making Leon's briefings perhaps a monthly Zoom covering the so many issues that needs Leon's explanation and analysis?
Well, I didn't pay them. Who was that? Very nice.
Karen and David, we know them very well. Welcome, Karen and David.
Thank you very much indeed.
Yes, good friends of ours, but we didn't pay them either. Well, I think we'll probably take that one offline, shall we, and talk
Tell him
about
to
it.
think about it.
Yes, we'll think about that one, but thank you for that. Adrian says, excellent presentation. Thank you. We've now got, coming down to earth, a more serious and sobering question. I watched this is from Steve Waldman. I watched 2 Zooms about the riots in Lod, Ramla and Akko from the leader of the NGO My Israel. Believe 7 Israelis were killed, some lynched, and the Israeli police stood by. This is worrying. So obviously these are the riots, a phrase that we never expected to use, anti-Semitic riots within Israel, that occurred around the time of the most recent Gaza conflict last May. So this is clearly, you did mention it, but this is clearly an event that kind of sadly goes against your rather optimistic prognosis. So what are your thoughts on that?
That's a good point. I don't think the Israeli police stood by. I believe they were overwhelmed. There were complaints from both sides that the Israeli police didn't stop retaliatory attacks. But yes, it is a concern. Let's not take it in isolation, though. Until the 1950s, there was quasi-martial law in Israel for the Arabs. In 1976, there was something called the land. I think there was land riots where Israeli Arabs in the Galilee rioted, and there were, I wouldn't say regular, but there have been outbreaks before. So notwithstanding that, yeah, it was very bad. I don't know if it's isolated. And I think it's a valid point. What can I say? You know, nothing is ever 100% good. There have been reconciliation steps, but I repeat the phrase that I say a lot, and that is, it's all about the narrative. So if the narrative of these people, these rioters in Lod and Ramla, which are central Israeli towns with large mixed Arab-Jewish populations, is a negative one, then that's something that absolutely needs to be dealt with. But generally, I'm still positive.
Okay, I suppose it's worth saying that there is never going to be unanimity in any population. So there are, to use the tired old expressions, there are moderates and extremists everywhere. And also, of course, it doesn't take that many people to start a riot. So a minority who have decided to be violent can cause an awful lot of problems.
Thank you.
But it doesn't necessarily represent all of those others who are probably sitting in their homes feeling rather worried.
I think that's a better answer than I gave. Thank you.
But no, I thought yours was very helpful. Okay, thank you for that. Barry says, excellent, many thanks. And the next actual question, Karen and David are asking, I don't know if it's quite on topic, but you may want to answer it. How do you feel the present coalition are performing vis-a-vis Netanyahu's government? And before you answer that, I should make the point that North London Friends of Israel does not get involved in what Israeli politicians should or shouldn't do. We support Israel effectively regardless of who the government is. But nevertheless, please give us your thoughts on that.
Thank you. Maybe it's a whole other Zoom talk, but what I will say is that I think the Prime Minister is an absolute magician, and I made the point at our annual general meeting that him becoming Prime Minister is a bit like the Liberal Party, which has a couple of dozen seats, I think, or the Social.
Not even that. But I know.
Becoming Prime Minister. Because that's effectively what he had. I think he had 7 seats out of 120. So I think it was absolutely masterful negotiation over the long term. So I know that that's maybe not the point of the question, but it shows to me that he's a great tactician. This is Naftali Bennett. I think I got his first name right. It is Naftali, isn't it?
Yeah.
Naftali Bennett. He's a great tactician. He outmaneuvered another great, masterful tactician, Netanyahu, who managed to hold power pretty much longer than, or about as long as Thatcher and Trudeau in the 1990s in Canada, stayed in power for 18 years in a democracy. Thatcher lasted 1979 to 19, over a decade, can't remember. So Netanyahu managed to stay in power for a very long time, possibly in a corrupt manner. I don't think. Oh, sorry. Again, this is my opinion. I think it's a typically unstable Israeli government, but they know it's unstable, and so they're moving heaven and earth to make it less unstable. My prediction is that in time, because the religious parties have been involved in government for decades, and that's the only way that they've managed to garner so much money for their myriad yeshivot, which are religious Jewish schools, I think they will find a way to what's the word? Not suck it up, that's too vernacular, to swallow their pride and see if they can enter the government. And they'll have much less power than previously, and the government will be a much stronger one. So what do I think of the government itself? I think it stabilized Israel. It meant that a budget which hadn't been agreed for 2 to 3 years was issued. So the Israeli army was deeply happy for that, because it couldn't plan ahead, and for lots of other reasons, the Israeli state couldn't think ahead. So as a North London Friends of Israel point of view, we don't care not don't care, but we don't take sides in Israeli politics. But I think it's very good for Israel generally to have an Arab in the Arab Muslim in the government for the first time ever. It totally negates the absolute nonsense and calumny of the apartheid slur. So the benefits in that respect.
Thanks very much. I'm reminded of one of the speakers that we had at our annual event in November, who was giving a talk on Israeli politics, and after at the end of a masterful analysis of the current situation in Israeli politics, the very last thing he said was, "But that's the situation today. Tomorrow it could all change." It'd be quite different. So I think we've probably learned that with Israeli politics, but thanks very much for that.
Yeah, just on that, the famous Moshe Dayan, if you remember him, the chap who had one eye, he was once asked by somebody, because he changed his opinion, volte-face, from one day to next. He said, he was asked, well, how can you possibly do that? How can you say such a thing? And Moshe Dayan simply said, what I thought yesterday was yesterday and today is today.
Absolutely. Okay, another question from David Stone. You may have touched on this already. Israeli Arabs now identify more as Israeli. Do you agree with this?
Yes, I do. In fact, this is something that I constantly write to The Guardian about.
Sorry, the question was from Brian, quoting David. I do apologize,
right, okay,
Brian.
thank you. I can't remember the exact figures, but I do constantly email it to The Guardian when they talk about Palestinians, because I think 78% of Israeli Arabs refer to themselves as Israelis. Small and micro percentages refer to themselves as Israeli Palestinians or just Arabs. A poll has been done. So you're absolutely right, Brian and David, that yes, for many reasons, they look across the Middle East, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, and they think, thank God my grandparents stayed. It's basically they're the clever ones who stayed, or the ones who didn't obey the Arab calls in 1948, the Arab states' calls to leave so we can throw the Jews into the sea. So they thank their lucky stars. In my view, in fact, I once heard an Israeli Arab speak, and he said there's a nickname. I love this one. He said there's a nickname that Arabs give to the Arabs across the Middle East give to Arab Israelis. I wonder if anyone can hazard a guess as to what it is. Let's put your thoughts in the chat.
I'm hoping it's not rude.
No, it's not rude at all. No. I'll count to 20 and then I'll give the answer.
Is it Yids?
Yids. Yids. No. It is, in fact, that was a quick 20. Very close. Lucky Devils. So they're actually nickname. The actual nickname is Fat Cats. Yeah.
That is fascinating. Thank you. Okay, there don't seem to be any more questions, so this might be a good time to begin to bring the session to a close. Thanks so much, Leon, for a fascinating and thought-provoking discussion. I'm sure there'll be many more questions that will occur to people. If so, please feel free to email them to North London Friends of Israel, and I will be putting up the contact details shortly.
Thank you, Harry. I hope I didn't bombard people with too many facts and statistics.
No.
Absolutely not. Thank you so much for that, Leon. Okay, well, thank you, Leon, once again. Fascinating talk, very interesting and very inspiring. And thanks very much to everyone for coming. So, North London Friends of Israel, as I said at the beginning, we're now back to our normal activities as soon after lockdowns. And we very much hope that as many of you as possible will feel able to get involved. Especially if you live in or around the North London area, please do get in touch with us, especially on our email address as shown here. So what do we do? Well, essentially, we are active in the local community. We have street stalls at locations around North London. We take part in local festivals. Of course, those activities came to a halt in the last couple of years because of COVID, but we're very much back to normal now. And since lockdowns ended late last year, we've already done street stalls in Hampstead, Enfield and Golders Green. And our next one is in High Barnet, which will be on the 19th of February. So that's actually a Saturday morning. We sometimes do them on Saturdays, sometimes on Sundays, and it very much depends on the nature of the location and which day will be most suitable. So that's High Barnet on the 19th of February. And following that, we're going to do another one in Hampstead, dates to be announced. Please do get in touch. We need more people to help us. Our activities are a really important way of putting Israel's case in our local area. We also talk to local politicians, and of course we take part in national campaigns and demonstrations. So our contact details are here. You can also support our online activities on Facebook and Twitter, as well as getting involved in the real world. So thanks once again, Leon, and thanks to all of you for your time and contributions. Thanks very much and good night. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for the recommendation for the falafel restaurant, Karen David.
Ah, thanks for that. All right. Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Good night.
Oh, yes, yes, we've been there.
Right.